All right, we are back together today to start talking about the second half of this positive and negative space drawing that we started. We had the one that we did on white paper and the one that we did on black paper, and we should just have an outline at this point. So what we're going to start talking about today is how to start adding value. Value is a degree of light to dark. This right here is a value scale, shows you your different ranges. They're really helpful because I can sit here and I can compare what value I have in light or darkness to what's on the picture that I'm looking at. I will make sure there's one of these on our page, on our art page, that you can print off. You can find one of these easily on the internet to where you could just print it off, use it. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna start to add shading to this composition now. And the way that we're gonna do it is we're gonna start to look at what the contours or the movement of this picture is. The first thing I usually like to do when I'm working on adding value is I start to try to get some of my darker areas in first, especially over on this side of the paper. Not as much over here because I don't want to be smearing my hand through it. Although a lot of times I stand when I draw so that my hand doesn't rest on the paper. But we're going to go ahead and we're just going to start to use some mark making to start to fill in some of these darkest areas. And I'm just going to make my marks go a random direction here, just to kind of get a feel for what we've got going on in this background here. And I'm gonna go as dark as I can because that's what I'm seeing in the background here. Now I'm gonna keep my marks going different directions because I don't want it to look like I've got a halo following this bird around. So I'm gonna mark in different directions to fill this in. Once I start to get rid of some of the white on this paper, it'll really get easier for me to start figuring out what way everything else needs to be shaded. We just have to start getting rid of some of this area that we know is going to be really dark so we can compare everything else to it. You can see how quickly we're starting to get that bird to pop out towards us because dark areas go back in space, light areas pop forward to the viewer. So we are dropping that background back into space right now and bringing our bird forward in the composition. When I'm shading, I don't limit myself to keeping the paper this direction either. If it's easier for me to spin it around this way to work, then that's what I'm gonna do. All right, I'm gonna start to get some of this dark area on this beak. I'm gonna make this a little bit more solid than what I was doing in the background to give it a different visual texture. We talked about those visual textures earlier on in the semester. Well, what we're looking at now is what's the difference in the visual texture between this beak and that background? How can I make them look different? So I'm gonna go with a smoother application on the beak. And I'm gonna follow the contour of the beak. The beak comes down and goes like this, and it kind of rounds this way a little bit on the edges. So I'm not gonna go back and forth this way for a movement that goes this direction. All right, now when we take a look at the neck here, because that's where I'm gonna start to shade next, we have some darker areas along where it starts to roll under and where it rolls around, and it's the brightest right where it's facing towards us. So we've actually got a shape like this that's facing us this direction, brightest, and it gets a little bit darker as we get to the edges, which makes this round. And once again, I'm not going to go this direction if the movement of the subject goes this direction. So let's go ahead and let's start to, I'm going to lighten my touch a lot here now. I'm going to push a lot less hard than what I was. I've spread my marks out a little bit more too. That's another way of getting a lighter value, is to make the marks further apart, as well as lighter pressure. I can start to compress how close the marks are when I get up in here in some of these darker areas. I'm not pushing any harder, I'm just putting more marks in a smaller space. I'm still working my big areas first, guys. I'm not going to start working on an eyeball for 30 minutes until I have the value of this bird in pretty well. I'm also leaving these line marks in here like this because it kind of gives us a sense of what's going on with the texture of the bird here. On the beak, I'm going to have very little through here because we have this really light area. It's going to get a little bit darker down in here. All right, I'm going to keep going this way through this whole composition. I have these lines here to kind of show the contour of where my feathers need to go. If I start to get too dark in some areas, I can subtractively draw as well. So if I get up here and decide that this is too dark in this area here, I'm going to take my eraser and I'm going to start to subtractively draw with it. So now I'm putting in wider lines here by pulling out some of that value. So you can draw subtractively just as easily as you can draw additively, where you're taking away from instead of adding to. Now that I have all my big players on the board up in this area, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start to make a few adjustments as well. Like I see that it's darker through here. So now is when I'm going to start worrying about smaller things like this eyeball. I can also see that this is relatively darker than that. since this is going to be close to what's going on here, the marks are going this direction on the wing, and they're following this contour of this object here. Now, on this up in here where we were talking about, I'm going to start to add just a little bit more value along the edge here. That's going to give us a rounding effect to that neck. Keep going with my feathers here. Even in my lightest areas, I try to put just a little bit of mark making so that we see a little bit of a visual texture to it. I'm going to come back in up in here now and start to pull out a little bit of this where it's a little bit lighter. And folks, I'm just going to keep spiraling down. So now that I've got all this detail up in here, I'm going to start to look at some of these smaller areas where the shading's a little bit darker. And I'm probably going to fill in a little bit better on this background through here so that it stays darker than what's going on in front. But as you can see, what I'm doing now is I'm going through, and if this were in black and white, it'd be a lot easier. I can sit here and I can compare. That's about a value 4 right there. So when I come over here, I see that I need to be a little darker right through here. All right, so I'm not gonna make you sit and watch me do this whole thing. It's just a matter of getting down into smaller details now, looking at these shapes of light and dark and getting everything plugged in where it needs to be. So I'll finish this drawing and put it on as the cover page, but I wanna move on to the next one real quick here so that you guys can see where we're going with this next. So I'm gonna set this guy off to the side for just a minute and we're gonna bring this guy in here. We've got our outline on our black piece of paper now too, but in the end, we want this one to look exactly like this one. What I'm forcing you to do with this is look at all these spaces, these lighter spaces that we usually ignore in a drawing. And now we're gonna come back and we're gonna start to put those marks in. So once you have your pencil drawing on the black piece of paper, we're going to start putting the light areas in this using a white colored pencil. We're going to put the light areas in more so and less mark making in the background. So some of my areas, if we go back to this guy again, let's go ahead and shuffle this over so we can see all of them at once. All right. Now, with this guy, I want it to look exactly like it did for this picture. So I'm going to come into some of my lightest areas first, and I'm going to start to figure that out. What we're doing now is we are taking a look at the parts of the picture that we usually ignore because the white paper does our work for us. And it's also starting to help us look at positive and negative shapes. So I'm going to have very little mark making down here in this black beak. And this works the same way as the other one. If I get too much in here, I can take the eraser and pull it back out. I'm going to put less mark making at the edge because I want it to be a little darker and more in the middle, the exact opposite of the process we did last time. I'm following my contours of my drawing. I'm not trying to shade this direction if the movement of the composition goes this way. This one's going to be the harder of the two drawings because we're doing exactly the opposite of what we're used to looking at. Take your time with it. It's really going to be a helpful exercise as far as learning to see and draw with shape. For this background here, I'm going to go as light as I can and just kind of put an impression that there's something going on back there. Just so we have a visual texture for that background. The drawing starts to look unfinished if we don't have some type of mark making in that background. I'm going to put very little, just enough to kind of give a feeling of some kind of textural element in the background. So in the end, what we want is we want to turn in a picture of the actual subject matter. You're going to turn in a photograph of the white paper drawing, and you're going to turn in a photograph of the black paper drawing. If you can lay them all three out together like this, take a picture of them and send them to me, that'd be great. I'd be able to compare all three of them, because what I'm grading on this assignment, I'm going to look at your reference material and I'm going to say, okay, this is a 9 value or an 8 value. And I'm going to come over here and I'm going to look and I'm going to say, is that about the same here and here? If it is, I'm going to move on to, okay, let's look at the darkest areas. Let's look at the lightest areas. I want all three of these compositions to look identical when you're done. Now, the biggest mistake that most people make with this is that they do a negative on this one, where they shade the exact same places on this drawing as they did this one here. And that's not what I want. The light spaces here need to be the light spaces on this composition as well. Any questions, give me a holler. Take your time with this. Talk to you soon.